The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the kind of day that didn't announce itself. No particular weather, no particular quality of light, just the ordinary gray of early autumn pressing against the kitchen window while Callum Hart sat at his table with a cup of tea he hadn't touched and a stack of bills he'd already read twice without absorbing a single number. He was 39 years old. He owned 43 acres of land in a county that was slowly forgetting how to be useful. He had a farmhouse with 4 rooms, a barn that needed its roof replaced by spring, a younger brother in the hospital for the third time in 2 years, and a daughter who was 8 and who asked questions he didn't know how to answer. The letter was from the agency. He'd written to them in a moment he preferred not to examine too closely, on a night in February when the power had gone out, and he'd sat in the dark long enough to understand that the weight he was carrying was not the kind a man could carry alone indefinitely. He'd asked for someone practical, someone honest. He'd been careful not to use the word lonely, though that was the word that had been sitting in his chest for years, quiet and unmoving, the way a stone sits at the bottom of cold water. The agency had written back 3 times before this. 3 women had read his letter and declined. The 4th letter introduced him to a woman named Maren Solis, and the agency noted with careful bureaucratic neutrality that she had also been declined by 3 previous matches. The letter did not say why. It said she was 34, originally from the coast, currently residing in a town 4 hours east, and that she had responded to his file with a single sentence: "I can work and I do not need to be entertained." Callum read that sentence 3 times. He set the letter down on the table beside the cold tea and looked out the window for a long moment. Then he wrote back and said, "Yes, if you've found this story already, stay until the end." What Maren carried with her when she arrived, what she'd been through and what she'd kept quiet, changed everything. Not in a dramatic way, in the only way that actually matters. He drove to the station on a Friday morning in October, his daughter Nora in the back seat asking if the new woman would know how to braid hair because her father, despite his many competencies, had never quite mastered it. Callum said he didn't know. Nora considered this and then said practically that they could teach her. He parked crooked and walked to the platform with his hands in his coat pockets and his collar up against a wind that came off the fields like it had somewhere better to be. He recognized Maren Solis immediately, though not because she looked the way he'd imagined. He hadn't allowed himself to imagine. He recognized her because she was the only person on the platform who was not moving, not checking anything, not looking for something she'd lost. She was simply standing with one large bag at her feet and a smaller one over her shoulder, watching the end of the platform as though she'd already calculated the distance and found it acceptable. She was medium height, dark-haired, dressed practically, a coat that had seen weather, boots that had walked on actual ground. She turned when she heard his steps and looked at him with dark, steady eyes that didn't flicker with anxiety or hope or performance. They were the eyes of someone who had decided in advance to see things clearly. "Callum Hart," he said. "Yes," she said. "Maren." They shook hands. Her grip was firm and brief. On the drive back, Nora asked Maren 17 questions without waiting for the answers to fully resolve before the next one arrived. Maren answered each one completely calmly, without condescension or false warmth. She knew how to braid hair. She had once owned a cat. Her favorite color was not pink. Her favorite food was soup, specifically the kind made with white beans. Nora absorbed all of this with the focused attention of a small scientist gathering data. Callum kept his eyes on the road and said nothing and was aware, in a way he hadn't expected, that the inside of the truck felt different than it had on the way to the station. Fuller, maybe, or just less hollow. The first weeks were not romantic. They were not supposed to be. They were practical and careful and full of the particular awkwardness of 2 people learning how a shared space works when neither of them is accustomed to sharing. Callum showed her the house room by room as though conducting an inspection he hadn't prepared for, explaining where things were kept, and what worked well and what required patience and what required force. Marin listened and didn't ask him to repeat anything. She moved through the kitchen the second morning as though she'd grown up in it, finding the flour before he'd thought to tell her where it was, adjusting the draft on the old iron stove with a confidence that made Nora look up from her cereal, and then look at her father with an expression that said, plainly, "This one is different." Marin asked questions that first week, but they were almost all practical. Where do the fence posts from the north field go when they're replaced? What is the name of the man who bought the hay last autumn? Is there an account at the supply store or does he pay cash? The books, she asked one evening, standing at the kitchen table where Callum had spread the farm ledger. Could she look at them? He handed them over without ceremony. She sat with them for 2 hours while he repaired a gate hinge and Nora did her spelling exercises at the other end of the table. When he came back in, Marin had made 2 columns on a separate sheet of paper and was frowning at them with the particular focus of someone who has found a problem and is already partway through solving it. "You're paying too much for the winter grain contract," she said, not looking up. "I know," he said. "Can I renegotiate it?" He looked at her. "Do you know how?" "I've done it before," she said. That was all. He put the kettle on. She continued working. That was how it started, not with a declaration or a gesture, but with a woman sitting at a farm table solving a problem that had been quietly bleeding the operation for 3 years, and a man who noticed, while he waited for the water to boil, that something in the house had shifted the way a room shifts when a window that's been stuck finally opens and lets in real air. By November, they had developed a routine that neither of them had formally decided on but which had arrived like weather, gradually and then completely. She rose before him and had the stove going by the time he came downstairs, not because she was obligated to, but because, as she told him once without sentiment, she slept lightly and woke early and a cold kitchen was a waste of a morning. He repaired things while she kept the accounts and negotiated what needed negotiating and managed the small but complicated ecosystem of suppliers and buyers and neighbors that a working farm required. She was better at it than he was, and he knew it, and he didn't resent it the way he thought he might have. What he felt instead was something closer to relief, which surprised him, because he had not known the specific exhaustion of doing every difficult thing alone until someone began doing half of them with him. Nora had attached herself to Marin with the unself-conscious velocity of a child who had made up her mind. She followed Marin to the barn in the mornings and stood on the bottom rail of the fence while Marin checked the water troughs and talked to her without being talked to, which was how Nora preferred things. On a Thursday in November, Callum came around the corner of the barn and found the 2 of them standing side by side looking at a crow that had settled on the fence post. Nora was explaining something about crows in the particular authoritative tone she used when she'd recently read something she considered important. Marin was listening with her arms crossed against the cold, nodding slowly. She glanced up when she heard Callum and something crossed her face briefly, not quite a smile, something just before a smile, a warmth that was gone before it fully declared itself. He looked away first. His neighbor, a man named Dex Purcell who ran the property east of the fence line and who considered restraint a form of dishonesty, appeared one afternoon that same week on the pretext of returning a borrowed wrench, and spent 11 minutes asking Callum questions about Marin that he framed as concern, but which were, under honest examination, simple curiosity poorly disguised. When Dex finally left, Callum went back inside and found Marin looking out the kitchen window with an expression he couldn't read, which he'd noticed was something she did when she'd overheard something she wasn't going to address unless asked directly. "He means well," Callum said. "He means to know things," Marin said. "That's not the same." The envelope arrived in December. Callum knew it was from the coast before he looked at the return address because it was a different kind of envelope than the ones that came from suppliers or the county offices, softer paper, sealed more firmly, as though it had been handled and reconsidered before being sent. He set it on the kitchen counter beside her when she came in from the barn. She stopped when she saw it. Her face didn't change the way most faces change when something unexpected arrives. It went still, which was different. Stillness in Marin wasn't absence, it was the opposite of absence. It was a presence turned entirely inward. She picked it up, looked at it, and put it in her coat pocket without opening it. She didn't open it that day or the next. Callum noticed and said nothing, because he understood instinctively that the right thing to do with some silences was not to fill them. He had his own silences of that kind. He thought about it at night, lying in the room that was separated from hers by the hallway and its particular darkness, turning over what he knew about Marin, which was in some ways considerable and in other ways almost nothing. He knew how she worked. He knew how she thought through problems. He knew that she kept a small photograph tucked into the back of the kitchen ledger book and had never mentioned it. He knew that she sometimes stood at the east window in the late afternoon and watched the road without explaining why. He knew that she was more capable than she let on and more vulnerable than she showed, and that both of these things were deliberate and connected, and that whatever the letter contained, it was part of the thing she had not yet trusted him enough to name. His brother Emmett called from the hospital the second week of December. The call was short and difficult in the way that calls from Emmett had been short and difficult for a long time now. Medical bills were what they were. The situation was what it was. Callum stood in the barn with the phone pressed against his ear and looked at the floor while Emmett told him the number, which was a number Callum did not currently have. He went back inside and sat at the table with his coat still on. Marin came in 10 minutes later, looked at him once, and set about making soup without asking anything. He told her anyway. Not all of it, not the depth of the debt or the exact figure, because he was not yet practiced at showing the full measure of a problem to anyone. But enough, she listened without interrupting. When he stopped talking, she sat down across from him and said, "How much time do we have? Not how did it get this bad, not that's terrible. Just how much time?" It was the most useful question anyone had asked him in years, and the fact that she'd asked it made something constrict in his chest in a way that had nothing to do with the debt. She opened the letter on a night in January when a storm had come down from the northern hills and closed the road, and the three of them had spent the day inside while the wind made the house speak in its old wooden language. Nora had fallen asleep on the sofa under a patchwork quilt. Callum was at the table. Marin took the envelope from where she'd kept it, not in her coat anymore, he noticed, but in the small wooden box on the shelf near her bed, the one that she'd placed there the first week as though staking a quiet claim on that particular inch of the house. She brought it to the table and set it between them. "I should have told you before," she said. He said nothing. She sat down. "The agency didn't tell you why I was declined by the others. It wasn't a question. No, they didn't tell me I should tell you either," she said. But they probably should have. What she told him then took 20 minutes, though the facts of it were not complicated. She had a son. He was 6 years old. He was living with her mother on the coast, which was where the letter came from, which was why she watched the East Road, which was why there was a photograph in the ledger book that she'd touched every morning without knowing he'd noticed. His name was Felix. He had been living with her mother because of a legal situation that was nearly resolved, a situation that had begun before Marin arrived in Callum's life, a situation involving a man who was not Felix's father but who had used the fact of the child as leverage in a dispute Marin had refused to lose. She had spent 2 years and everything she'd saved fighting it. The letter from her mother said the final hearing had been scheduled. It said that if Marin could show the court that she had a stable home and a stable life, Felix could come to her permanently within 60 days. She had watched Callum's face while she said all of this, and his face had done what it usually did, which was very little on the surface. He looked at the table, he looked at his hands, then he said, "Is he healthy?" "Yes," she said. "Does he know about this place?" "My mother's told him about the farm," she said. "He wants to know if there are chickens." There were chickens. Callum put his hands flat on the table. Then you'll need to bring him here, he said, so he can see that there are. Marin looked at him for a long moment, and the stillness in her face broke open, not loudly, not in tears or declarations, but in the way a field breaks open in early spring when the frost finally releases it, quietly, entirely, and all at once. The hearing was in February. Marin took the bus to the coast, and Callum stayed home with Nora and spent 4 days doing every task on the farm twice over because keeping still was not something he did well when he was waiting for something that mattered. Dex Purcell came by on the second day, this time without the pretense of a borrowed tool, and stood in the yard and said, with the bluntness of a man who had decided that ceremony was a form of waste, "You care about her." Callum didn't answer. "Not a criticism," Dex said, "an observation." "Appreciated," Callum said, and went back to the fence post he was replacing. Dex stood there another moment, then said, "The grain renegotiation she ran through in November saved you 14% over the season." "I asked around," he left after that. Callum drove the fence post into the frozen ground and thought about 14%, and about the way Marin had asked how much time they had, and about the photograph in the ledger book, and about the fact that in the 4 months she'd been here she had, without spectacle or announcement, made his house function better and his days feel less like a ceiling pressing down and his daughter feel like she had an ally. And he thought about all of this with the careful emotional restraint of a man who has been alone long. Enough that feeling something real requires a moment of standing still with the feeling before he can believe it's not a mistake. Marin came back on a Thursday afternoon. He heard the truck on the road. Dex had driven her from the station as arranged, and came out of the barn with his coat open and his hands dirty from the engine work he'd been doing. And she was already out of the truck before it fully stopped, which was not something she typically did, and she looked at him across the yard with an expression that was not the controlled, careful stillness he'd become accustomed to. It was not that, it was something raw and grateful and exhausted and clear all at the same time. "He's coming," she said. He was still 10 feet away. "The first week of March," she said. He walked the rest of the distance. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I'll fix the room at the end of the hall." She nodded. She pressed her lips together. She looked away at the hills for exactly long enough to recover herself, then looked back at him. "Thank you," she said. He said, "No, because thank you was not the right word between people who were building something together, and he needed her to know that." She understood. He could see that she understood. The following month was full. There was the room to clear and paint, which Nora supervised with executive authority, insisting on a particular shade of blue that she had decided Felix would prefer even though she'd never met him. There was Emmett, whose situation had stabilized after Marin, quietly, without being asked. The way she did most of the things that mattered had found a different care arrangement that cost 30% less, and came with the support of the county's medical program, which Callum hadn't known existed, and which she'd located by making a series of phone calls with the methodical patience of someone who assumed that solutions existed until proven otherwise. There was the barn roof, which Callum and Dex finished in 4 days of cold work with Marin keeping them fed, and Nora handing up shingles with the solemnity of someone assisting in a sacred operation. And there was, in the ordinary evenings that accumulated through that winter, something that wasn't exactly talk and wasn't exactly silence, but was something between the two, a quality of presence in the kitchen at night, at the table where two people sat with the day between them, where sometimes she read and he worked on something, where sometimes she said a thing and he answered it, and where what passed between them in those exchanges carried more weight than the words themselves could hold, not because they were performing anything, but because they had stopped performing anything and were simply, finally, there. Felix arrived on a Saturday in early March when the last of the winter was still thinking about whether to stay. He was small and serious and had his mother's eyes, that same quality of looking at things directly and entirely, as though partial attention were not something he'd been taught. Maura had driven them both from the bus station, Nora beside Callum in the truck, and when they pulled into the yard and Marin got out and turned to lift Felix down from the step, Nora was already out of the truck and walking toward them with her hands in her pockets and her most authoritative expression in place. She stopped in front of Felix and regarded him for 3 seconds. "There are 11 chickens," she said. "One is named Gerald and he's unpleasant. Don't trust Gerald." Felix looked at her, then he looked at the barn. "Can I see them?" "Yes," Nora said. "Come on," and that was that. They walked to the barn together without looking back. Callum watched them go and felt something so plain and large move through him that he had no vocabulary for it and didn't need one. Marin stood beside him, close enough that he could hear her exhale slowly. He didn't look at her right away. He looked at the barn, at the two small figures disappearing through the door, at the fields beyond where the frost was breaking and the ground was beginning slowly to soften. Then he looked at her. She was watching the barn too, and her face had that opened quality he'd first seen in January, present, unguarded, grateful in a way that went too deep for the word to carry its full meaning. "He likes it already," Callum said. "He does," she said. He'd repaired 4 fence posts that week, fixed the east window that had stuck since October, painted the room at the end of the hall the specific shade of blue that Nora had decreed. He hadn't done any of these things as gestures. He'd done them because they needed doing and because he was a man who showed what he valued through the work of his hands, and this, all of them was what he valued. She knew that. He knew that she knew. He said, "There'll be more to sort out. It won't all be easy." "No," she said, "it won't." A pause. The wind came through the yard carrying the first real warmth of the year, just a thread of it, just enough to notice. "But you're staying," he said. It was not quite a question. She turned and looked at him with those steady dark eyes that had been watching him clearly since October, that had seen the debt and the grief and the difficulty and the need, and had not flinched or retreated or calculated a way to protect herself from what was real. "I'm staying," she said. That was all. That was everything. It had the weight of a door being set firmly on its hinges after a long time opening and closing against the wind. Callum nodded. He looked at the barn one more time. Through the cracked open door he could hear Nora's voice, explaining something about Gerald with the serious urgency she brought to all important information, and under it Felix's quieter response, and under that the ordinary sound of the morning, the chickens, the fields, the wind beginning to warm. He put his hands in his coat pockets. He was still not a man of many words. He was still a man who said most of what he felt through the steadiness of his presence, through the fact of showing up, through the repaired fence and the painted room and the tea he set on the table every morning before she came downstairs, not because it was required, but because he'd learned in the long winter months of building a life beside someone that love in its most honest form is not a declaration. It is a practice, a daily returning, a choice made not once but in every ordinary morning, in every shared problem, in every evening at the table where two people sit with the weight of the day between them and are not diminished by it but held. On the shelf in the kitchen, the ledger book sat where it always had. The small photograph of Felix was no longer tucked in the back of it. It was on the wall above the stove now, in a frame Nora had painted carefully in the same blue as the room at the end of the hall. Marin had put it there on the morning after the hearing, quietly, without ceremony, the way she did everything that mattered. In the photograph, Felix was laughing at something outside the frame, his head thrown back, completely unguarded. Every morning when she made the tea and Callum came downstairs and the stove warmed the kitchen against the lingering cold, she stood for one moment in front of that photograph, the way she used to stand at the east window watching the road. Not waiting anymore, just remembering that she had been waiting and that the waiting was over and that this, the warm kitchen, the sound of Nora's feet on the stairs, the way Callum set his cup down without looking up, familiar as the furniture, solid as the walls, this was the life she had not dared to name when she was alone, and which she was now, quietly and completely and without any remaining doubt, living.